Archiving started.
Okay, we are going to be covering Chapter 7, which is entitled Contemporary Online Legal Research. This chapter I'm going to do pretty quickly and not in a lot of detail because it's not one that there's going to be much substantive questions on. There won't be any on the final, I do not think. And there will be, I guess, one or two questions on the next test that you have, but it won't receive a very deep treatment. So I'm going to highlight those facts that might be on a test and emphasize those during the presentation. But we're going to do this pretty quickly. The reason that we're going to go through it so quickly is not because it's not an important topic, but simply because during this course, most of the students in this class will not currently be taking legal research. And legal research, when you're taking legal research, that's the only semester that you will be given access to Westlaw, which is an online legal research tool. So it's a little bit hard to describe and discuss something that you can't actually use and see. And so I'll give you some theoretical knowledge, but mainly we'll be focusing on other parts of the book. And so let's get started with some of the stuff is fairly obvious. We use computers and online databases, obviously, to assist with legal research. Just like you would do any type of research, there's a lot of legal research materials that are available online. And one of the big benefits to that is the same benefit that other research reasons or purposes might include, and that is that material can be updated very quickly. If you wait for it to come out in a book, it'll be several weeks or months after the time of the publication. So especially when you are practicing in an area of law that is constantly evolving, having access to online tools can be very, very useful. And as I say, we talked a little bit about the book versions of the online tools, but nowadays, probably it's more common, at least in the United States, for people to be using the online resources more commonly. Obviously, you will be using tools like email, the web to find stuff. A uniform resource locator is a URL. That's the location on the Internet that you would find a particular tool. For an example, if the URL for Collin.edu academics would lead you to that particular website. And obviously there's websites being added every day, some going obsolete. It's a constantly evolving process. And we'll be talking about some of the resources that are available today, but in 5 years, many of them will be different, and there'll be a lot more, I'm sure. This is actually relevant more to our WIMBA presentation than anything else, but Internet Explorer, Firefox, Google Chrome, things like that. It's good if you're having trouble with some kind of online resource to check to make sure that whatever software or database you're accessing is compatible with that if you're having difficulties. And then, of course, there are search engines. You can certainly use Google and Bing and Yahoo and all those other ones. But, of course, we will also be talking about using proprietary legal search engines such as the ones in Westlaw and Lexis as well. So when you are thinking about whether to use the Internet or not, one question, of course, to ask yourself is this the right tool for your project? And some things you might want to ask is, am I researching a quickly evolving area of the law? If you aren't, then more likely, especially if you have access to good books, you may be able to save your client some money if you were to do it through the use of books. Although I'll tell you, many of the online resources that are used today, a law firm will buy a subscription for a whole month, and it doesn't really matter how many times that you're using it. So sometimes, even if it is not a quickly evolving area of the law, it may make sense to go ahead and do the research online. For one thing, it will likely be quicker, and for another, if you're not paying more for it, then really there's no reason to avoid the convenience of it. But some resources are not available online. If it's a proprietary topic or a proprietary resource and Lexis or Westlaw hasn't bought a subscription to it, then you may find that the only way to really benefit from it is by getting the book. And this is especially true for Hornbook and treatises, that are maybe updated every year or two. Then, of course, you'll want to consider the cost and the time that you might use, especially if there's going to be an additional cost for using the online resource. You might want to consider, is the client going to be open to paying for that? It may actually end up being cheaper for the client because you'll be able to find the information quicker, but will the client be unhappy to see that type of cost on the bill? And then, of course, what is the accuracy of the resource that you're going to be using? Obviously, there's fly-by-night and very opinionated resources on the Internet. You want to make sure the resources that you're relying upon are accurate, not reasonably well balanced, and are going to give you reliable information. And so we'll talk about some of the more reliable tools for that perspective. Okay, let's talk about Boolean logic. This topic, the topic of Boolean logic, is important that you know about. So this is one of the topics that I'm going to encourage you to think about and focus on. In Boolean logic, when you have A and B, you're really looking at the intersection of A and B. If you think of a Venn diagram, you're looking at this part right here, the overlapping part. So if you were to say statutes and limitations, you want cases that use the word statute and use the word limitations. You don't want cases that use the word statute but don't have the word limitations. That would be this area right here where I'm putting the dots. You also don't want cases that use the word limitations but don't use the word statutes, where I'm putting the X's now. You want this area right here where I'm putting the dark dots. That includes both statutes and limitations. Okay, I'm going to clear this. Here we go, erase. And I'm going to do the OR. A or B is going to be the whole picture. Yes, it's going to include the intersection, these dots, but it will also include assault, where a case that just talks about assault but doesn't talk about battery, and it will also include this section which talks about battery but doesn't include assault. So it's going to be this whole shape. You're going to get all the cases in all three of the containers. And let's talk about A, not B. Again, go back to our picture. The classic for this is Rico, but not Puerto. So let's say this is the Rico side and this is the Puerto side. You want cases that talk about Rico, which is the racketeering statute. But of course, Rico in that context is spelled the same way as the Commonwealth Puerto Rico is called. So you don't want cases about Puerto Rico. You want cases just about Rico. So you want only cases in this area. Now, in theory, you are losing some cases that are Puerto Rican Rico cases. But unless, let's say you're not litigating a case in Puerto Rico, you're less concerned about that. So by saying A, not B, Rico, but not Puerto, you are giving up this category. You aren't going to get cases in this category. You're also giving up this category. You are just going to get cases that talk about Rico. Any case that talks about Rico and Puerto is not going to be considered. So be sure that you know that. This is from the textbook, and this gives you the same type of information. In this case, you want Georgia and bankruptcy and forms. If you were to have had access to, say, let's say you wanted bankruptcy and forms but not Georgia, it would be this box right here. But you want all three of these terms. If one of these terms is missing, you're not interested in that information. This is vehicle or car or automobile. The or is commonly used when you have synonyms. In an opinion, the judge might have always used the word car, or might have always used the word automobile, or might have always used the word vehicle. But since those are synonyms, it doesn't make sense to just focus on one of the terms. You might even come up with other words, such as auto, or even truck, or for something else. And here we have gambling, but not online, not internet. You're looking really at this shape right here. So you're focusing on your garden variety, old-fashioned gambling in that situation. So know about Boolean, know how that works. Here are some resources that are free. Big one here is Cornell. Cornell, I recommend that you visit this to kind of see the resources that are available. It's very commonly used by legal professionals. FindLaw is also used sometimes, but I would say Cornell is the one that really merits you paying some attention to. You can usually find primary legal resources on the Internet. You'll be able to find statutes. You'll be able to find at least recent cases. You'll be able to find regulations. What you're going to miss out on with respect to primary sources are tools that help you find the case. Yes, if you know the name of the case, you'll be able to find it. But how are you going to know what the name of the case is? In that situation, you aren't going to be able to look at every single case that comes down. Well, you're going to need a secondary resource to help you figure out which cases are worthy of let's say you're doing a dog bite case. Your client has been bitten by a dog, and he wants to know whether he's a good case. Well, if you knew the name of the primary dog bite cases in Texas, you'd be in good shape. You'd be able to find them and look at them on the Internet. But since you don't know the names of the cases, and there really aren't free ways of finding those names of the cases, you're stuck. So you're going to need secondary sources to get to that point. Again, secondary sources are input that either describe the law to you or that help you find the law. And this involves, of course, in the case of primary law, we're talking about the government having prepared these resources. And obviously the government is here for our benefit. We pay our taxes, so it's going to make its information available easily to us. But secondary sources, somebody has, through their own blood, sweat, and tears, found this information, and they don't want to give it away for free. Can you blame them? It took them time and money to find the information. They want somebody to pay them for the information. And so secondary sources are very valuable in finding those cases, and sometimes even statutes and other pieces of information. But you're not going to find those free on the Internet usually. So you will want to consider when you need to have a secondary resource, either using books or some kind of fee-based service. Here are some other free online services. This one is actually useful. This will give you recently published cases that arise in the state of Texas. It's www.courts.state.tx.us. Useful tool here. This one less so. And you can also use the University of Michigan Libraries resource thing. This isn't as helpful, but there's some things there. And you will find that government offices oftentimes have pretty extensive websites, so that's a good place. If you know what the government agency is that prepares regulations in a given area or other guidance in a given area, going to that website can be a good tool. Let's look at Lexis and Westlaw. You will need, this is a slide that you do need to know about. These are the two main fee-based resources. They're both very well regarded. They're both very reliable. They're both very useful. And it's almost certain that you will use one or the other, or probably both, at different points in your career. Generally speaking, people's preferences usually are whatever they're used to dealing with is what they like best because it's familiar. But I will tell you probably slightly more people prefer Westlaw over Lexis. Westlaw is at least perceived to be a little bit more user-friendly. It has that key number system that we talked about in Chapter 6, which Lexis doesn't have. Lexis usually is a little bit cheaper than Westlaw, so that's the advantage to Lexis. But at the end of the day, you can, even if you're used to the other, you can quickly and easily go and switch to the other tool. They each have their own little proprietary advantage, but at the end of the day, both are very, very fine resources. And they're both very comprehensive. They really cover the law in the 50 states. And typically, at least nowadays, the fees are usually on a monthly subscription basis, and they're not based upon the number of hours that you spend. So once your law firm has signed you up for it, there's really no reason to use books except in areas where books might be the only way to get at a piece of information. Of course, the way that they bill might change over time, and there may not be every subscription system that is based upon a flat fee. So be sure you understand what the fee structure is for your law firm so that you don't inadvertently run up a big bill. There's lots of different ways to research over Lexis and Westlaw, and again, since we don't have access, we're not going to go over the details. But it's good to spend some time on their websites to kind of learn how to go about efficiently using the system if you haven't been exposed to it before. One thing that you pretty much have to go to Lexis or Westlaw to these days is checking citations. Let me first of all stop and tell you a little bit about what checking citations means. Imagine that you've just found a great case. It was published in 1980, and it covers exactly the topic that you were trying to research. You've read the case, and you love it. It is so strong for your client. And you want to put it in the brief that you're about to write, and you're persuaded that if only the court reads this opinion, the court will immediately decide that your client ought to win. So this is a really helpful piece of information. Well, you're not done yet. You found the case, you're about ready to write it up, but there's one problem. You can't tell right now whether it's still good law. It's possible that in 1981 or 1991 or 2001 or maybe even January of 2013, some court has reversed that decision. And if you were to cite a case that had been reversed, the other side, your opponents in this lawsuit, are very likely to find that, and then you're going to have egg all over your face. You have cited an opinion that has been reversed. That's very sloppy on your part, and so you definitely don't want to do this. So you always, always, always have to shepherd. It's called shepherdizing or checking citations to make sure what you're citing is good law. The product that historically has been used for this is called shepherds, and as a result, the term that is oftentimes used for this is shepherdizing. When you hear people say shepherdizing, what they mean is to make sure that the case that you are about to use is still considered good law. Even people who don't use the Shepherds product will refer to it as shepherdizing. Shepherds is actually now owned by Lexis, and Westlaw owns a similar product called key citing. So I suppose it's possible that you'll run across someone who will call it key citing instead of shepherdizing. Having said that, though, I'd say probably 90% of the people in the world who know what Shepherds is refer to it as shepherdizing. In addition to the KeyCite system in West and the Shepherd system in Lexis, you can actually use Shepherd's books to shepherdize cases. The actual book version of Shepherds is, though, quite clunky to use. You have to flip through tons of volumes to find your answer. And because it's so clunky, very few people nowadays actually use the book version, and most people rely upon the Lexis Shepherd product or the Westlaw KeyCite product. But I wanted to add this term and also let you know that it's a very important part of any type of legal research that you do to shepherdize the case. And so for KeyCite is the Westlaw term for that. It tells you, just like Shepherds, when a case has been overturned, what subsequent cases have cited or referred to that particular case. In addition to Shepherds or KeyCite, either one, in addition to letting know if your case is no longer good law, it's also a good tool to find cases that are similar, because you can find cases that have cited your case. Well, if it cited your case, probably it's talking about that same topic. So it can also be useful to find other cases that might be helpful in your research. When you are working with either Lexis and you're trying to find cases, typically, or many cases we'll say, but typically you're going to want to get into a database. For example, let's say you want to find out about dog bite cases in the state of Texas. Well, a dog bite situation is a tort, and so it's mainly going to be litigated in state court. And of course, we know that the dog bite happened in Texas, so you're very likely to go to Texas state court cases to find out the current law in that area. So that would be an example of how you'd select the database. Yes, you could go to the All States database. You'd find a lot more cases, but you really don't care what the rule is in Alabama or Oregon or some other state. You are focused on Texas cases. So you'd want to pick a database that matches your level of scope of the investigation or your research. You don't want it to be too broad or too narrow. So once you select a database, when you go into it, you will do that Boolean type research that we talked before using connectors like and, or, not. You'll also use quotation marks to reflect when you have the exact words that you want to appear in the case. In addition to the Boolean method, which is oftentimes called the terms and connect method, of course the connectors are the words such as and, or, not, and then there's others. One that you will see often is within a certain number of words, or within a sentence, for example, or maybe within 10 words. That might be a way to show. So you might have the word let's see, the word in 2 words, North Carolina, if you're caring about North Carolina. Or you might just put the phrase North Carolina in quote, also work. Once you've gotten your research results, you might find that it turned up more cases than you really think you want. Maybe it turns up 300 cases, and you don't have time to look at 300 cases. So you might do a search within your results, for example, to narrow your research further. And then let's say of those 300 cases that you're searching again, it finds 50 cases that have your more narrowed search requirements. So now 50, maybe you have time to look at those. So the bottom line is both Lexis and Westlaw are very useful resources. They're not really extremely expensive anymore. Most law firms find that they are a good investment and are actually cheaper than having the book. So when you are taking legal research, please use that research tools that you have so that you can maximize your exposure to it. Having Lexis and Westlaw skills will definitely improve your virality, your marketability out there, and be sure that experience with either or both that goes on your resume, even if it's in a classroom setting. There are other online programs other than Westlaw and Lexis, although certainly Westlaw and Lexis are the market leaders. PACER is different than Lexis or Westlaw. It stands for Public Access to Court Electronic Records, and it just lists federal opinions and case dockets, cases that are still being litigated. It can be a useful resource if there are certain cases that you're following as they percolate through the court system. But it certainly doesn't replace Lexis or Westlaw because it's not going to have case from in the past. FastCase is much more similar to Lexis and Westlaw. It's cheaper, but it performs many of the same functions. If your law firm is smaller, maybe doesn't want to make the investment in Lexis and Westlaw, it might have FastCase. But more likely, it's going to have CaseMaker. Let's first of all talk about Lois Law. Lois Law has really decided to become a more robust program, and it's not there yet. It's so much cheaper than Lexis or Westlaw, but it can be a good resource. One of the problems that it has is it's not a good case citator yet to make sure that case law is still current and good. But it's making some strides. CaseMaker is something that if your attorney with whom you work is a member of the bar in Texas, that he or she already has access to. He may not have access to it, so if you may want to alert them to the fact that they can pull up cases through CaseMaker, and if they're current on their bar dues, they're already signed up for that. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Versus Law is not something I have any direct experience with, but it is another resource that can be available for especially students. So what are some ways to look at online research? Well, one thing is to plan ahead. Think about, before you get online, especially if you're paying on a minute-by-minute basis, to think about what database is most appropriate, even to draft some queries. Now, the first time you draft a query and you stick it in, you might find that you get 100 cases. Well, let's say more than 100. Let's say 500 cases. Well, realistically, you're not going to be able to look at 500 cases. But maybe on another time you type in your query and you find it only pulls up 3 cases. Well, you probably want to find more than 3. So one of the things that you might think through or anticipate is, how am I going to edit this query if I get a lot of hits? Or how am I going to edit this query if I get very few hits? So you might want to think through ways of broadening it or shrinking it, so that you can make sure that you're getting the information that you need. There are blogs that people who practice in a given area will send on the internet as kind of client development tools. There are online discussion boards and other things in particular subjects, and it's definitely worthy of thinking about as you practice in this area, to be members of those. There's groups for paralegals too, so those are just some things to keep in mind. When you're actually doing a research project, another thing I recommend that you keep in mind is a list of where you've been, what I'm going to call your research path, and where you're going. It's very fine to end up doing the same type of research again and again and again, especially if you're doing the research over several days. If you're not keeping a record of where you're going, you may find yourself kind of going around in circles. Okay, so you've developed some information, and now you're trying to decide how to process it. Well, definitely always consider the source's reliability. If it's Lexis or Westlaw or a governmental resource, it's going to be very credible. But if it's a source that you're not familiar with, maybe it's an individual attorney, you don't know what his or her agenda is. He or she may not even be practicing in Texas, so the information that he or she provides may be accurate in his or her jurisdiction, but not here. Or this attorney may have an agenda. He or she may have a particular political perspective, and so he's suggesting that this is what the law is, when really he means this is what I wish the law was. So think through those issues. Make sure that if something doesn't seem right, that you're confirming it independently by looking at the cases. Primary sources are almost always going to be credible. I mean, no one's really going to create a fake case, but opinions and evaluations of those cases may be less than credible. So read the cases to confirm the information that you're getting. In addition to doing pure legal research, as a paralegal, you may be asked to do some more business-focused research. You may be asked to find people. For example, your client was in a car accident, he's being sued by another person. You police report and you see that Sally Johnson was a witness to the case. So you're going to look for Sally Johnsons who live in Plano, Texas. Well, there's probably several. And so you'll want to find Sally. The resource tools that you'll be using for this aren't necessarily legal focused, but they are going to help you find people. And there's lots of different techniques for this. Actually, both Lexis and Westlaw have a lot of people find and asset find and corporation find services. So you can use those, but you can also use a lot of other resource tools. So some things to think about. If you're trying to find out who owns a given car, who owns a given piece of property, where somebody lives, where someone may have lived in the past, a lot of that information is obtainable over the internet, usually for a fee, or in Lexis and Westlaw. And, of course, investigating companies, there will be filings with governmental agencies. Many times when you look up those filings, they will be having a minor fee associated with them. One place to look for, say, Texas corporate filings is that you would look to the Texas Secretary of State file. If this is a publicly traded company, it's going to be in the Securities and Exchange Commission's EDGAR online resource. But you might also want to look in newspaper archives if your company that you're researching has been active in a particular litigation, or there's been a particular scandal or other information that's out there in the public. You may want to find out what's being said about it and what's going on with respect to that. So here's a summary of some things to keep in mind. And by the way, the big call-outs for you to know for this are how you do in research, and Lexis and Westlaw, how that plays out. Also that you can locate information about people and other resources on the internet. Of course, when you do that type of research, many times you're going to get a lot of leads that don't pan out. After all, you may find you're trying to connect 20 Sally Johnsons before you find the one that you're actually looking for. Yes, the information isn't always going to be accurate, isn't always going to be up to date, but it's a quick way to find people, even if you do end up making some calls that don't end up paying off right away. It's a quick and easy way to find people in many cases. So take one is that the internet has a huge amount of legal information and a lot of different ways of approaching it. And many of the statutes and other primary legal resources are going to be public documents that are free for you online. The challenge oftentimes is finding that information, not finding the database, but being able to navigate through the database to find the information that you want. And that's where Lexis and Westlaw comes in handy. If you're willing to pay the fee, you can get a lot of very credible, useful information. And then, of course, you can find out information about doing effective online research that may be not strictly legal, but is going to help you find witnesses or potential plaintiffs or potential defendants or where assets are located. Always remember that when you are doing legal research that you have to make sure your research is up to date and that you shepherdize your cases. If you have any questions, be sure to bring them to class and ask them or come to my office hours so we can talk about it in more detail. Thanks for your attention. This concludes Chapter 7. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.